Welcome everybody to Ring of Fire Con, Writing in Pandemics. I am here today with our illustrious panel. I am going to go around the ring, as it were, to have everybody introduce themselves, starting to my right, Miss Virginia DeMarce.
How do you do? I'm Virginia DeMarce. I have written pandemics, not from the medical standpoint, but from the administrative and quarantine standpoint, how people handled pandemics in the period and to what extent this will be affected by both uptime methodology and uptime medical innovations.
Excellent. And to my lower right, Dr. David Brin.
Hello all. I've sort of danced along the edge of the Flintiverse, but it is, I think, one of the funnest things that's ever come out of our field. And Virginia, I very much enjoyed those stories. And I think I well recall one of Edith's. I have done pandemics in wearing my different hats, and I'll offer a link or two to both a couple of science fiction stories. There's one that was Hugo nominated called The Giving Plague that talks about the various trade-offs of the various ways in which viruses negotiate with us as hosts. But also I've given courses at the Naval Postgraduate School and at the CIA on threats and possible failure modes. And one of the biggest is our lack of resilience, which we've proved the last 8 months or so, our lack of ability to react quickly to the things that science fiction has long warned everybody about.
Excellent. And Eric Flint?
Me? Because I write so much historical fiction that's either historical or alternate history, but it's rooted in history, I discovered pretty early that people nowadays, well, it's not true any longer, but people nowadays, at least in advanced industrial countries, tend to sort of take the lack of infectious disease kind of for granted. I mean, you know, the big killers are supposed to be things like cancer and heart disease and diabetes and so forth. But, you know, what has in fact been the great killer throughout most of human history, which was infections, we tend to sort of think, well, it's something of the past. And when you read as much history as I do and write as much history, you begin realizing just what an enormous impact it has on human society, and in ways that you don't really think about. I'll give an example. Is my very first novel, Mother of Demons. The alien species that the humans encounter has a completely different reproductive strategy. It's called the R strategy as opposed to the K strategy, which is ours. The K strategy is species that have very few offspring and lavish a lot of care on them. The R strategy is species which have a jillion number of offspring and just pretty much let them survive or not. And just how much of the death rate there is. And then realizing that for most of human history, you know, half of all people would be dead by the time they're 5 years old. And at least once you get to civilized society, hunting gathering societies tend to be healthier, just because they're so isolated, if nothing else. Anyway, I'm going to stop there because we'll go on to it, but it just became something that was part of my fiction from early on. And what struck me was how generally little science fiction in the future deals with it, unless it's some immediate apocalyptic thing like Michael Crichton's The Andromeda Strain or something like that.
Which we will get to in a second.
Right, yeah, but anyway, enough.
All right. Miss Wild?
Hey, I'm Edith Wild. I'm a writer, a teacher. I'm very interested in pandemics and in the history of disease because I teach English literature and it's bound together, especially in the older things like Beowulf and the Canterbury Tales. It's always there.
Excellent. And Ms. Holland? Ms. Holland, I think you need to unmute yourself, ma'am.
Beg your pardon?
We cannot hear you, Ms. Holland.
How could you not hear me?
Excellent.
Now we
I
can.
hear you.
Okay, here you go. I'm Cecilia Holland. I write historical fiction. I wrote about the Black Death in my novel, The Laws of Wilmarton. But I want now to refer to another book, which is Plagues and Peoples by William McNeill, which is a wonderful piece of history that shows how pandemics have changed history from the beginning of time. And this book was published back in the 1960s, I think. And at the time, it revolutionized the way people saw disease. Now we take it, we understand it better. But then nobody had considered this. And it's a brilliant book. Anybody interested in this should read this book. Again, Plagues and Peoples, William McNeill, great historian.
Excellent. All right. Well,
I have that book. It is excellent.
excellent. Well, we'll start with the questions. I mean, I can't think of a more probably timely panel in terms of human society and human history than, really writing pandemics. And really, in terms of historical fiction, we talked about, pandemics have existed in fiction in the past. My question is this, is that pandemics have shaped history. How do you think in writing them, you look at how they change society? And go.
All right, I'm going to start then, if nobody
Please.
else opened his or her mouth.
I was waiting for someone.
Yes. My background is as an early modern historian. My doctorate's from Stanford. My dissertation was the administrative career of Georg III Truchsess von Waldburg. And therefore, administration, how government, and there was extraordinarily little government in the early modern period by any modern standard. One of the most difficult things I have to deal with is trying to make people understand how incredibly small bureaucracies were, and that there was no such thing as a distinction between civil service and military service, really. People flipped back and forth from one to the other all the time. You'll find a general conducting a diplomatic mission and then gathering a few regiments round and round. In the book that Eric chose to title The Legions of Pestilence a year before COVID-19 came along, which was very timely of him, there is one entire chapter, chapter 9, on the subject of the administrative response to plague in the 17th century. It builds out of the approach that I started when I wrote A Gift from the Duchess about the siege of Kronach, with bubonic plague in Kronach. And this has expanded it to the moving with 3 experienced plague doctors from trained at the University of Padua, trying not just to quarantine a city or an Italian city-state, but what will be necessary to try to quarantine the entire western border of the United States of Europe.
Oh my.
In other words, they are moving to exponentially expand a methodology that was really on hand already. And what they say basically that it's this expansion that would never have occurred to them without modern ideas.
All right. Anybody else in going off of what Mr. DeMarce said? Cecilia, I cannot hear you, ma'am.
I don't know why. Why can't you? Can you hear me now?
So now
Yes,
we can.
ma'am. Now we can.
Maybe I'm holding the thing wrong. One of the most interesting features of the 6th century were the Justinian plagues, which erupted in the 550s or something, came up out of Egypt, was bubonic plague, and racketed around Mediterranean ports, just killing people. Something like they were saying 1,000 people a day were dying in Constantinople. This sounds familiar, I'm sure. This was major change, and it changed history totally, because the Arabs, who were inland people, did not get this disease. And when a couple of generations later, they erupted out of Arabia, they galloped off across North Africa. They found no resistance because there were no people left. The plagues weakened the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire so badly that they had no way to resist, really.
Interesting.
So this is a major influence in why we have Islam now.
That's fascinating, sister. You know, I had never thought about that. I remember it's always been something that kind of puzzled me a little bit. It was exactly why were the Arabs so successful so quickly? Because, you know, it wasn't that they had some fantastic, it wasn't like they were the Zulus or the Spartans or some society had a really well-organized military. I hadn't thought of that at all. But yeah, you're right. Justinian's plague was, it came right after the Belisarius period that I wrote.
Right, yes.
Series in. It came right after that. And in the books I wrote, it wasn't there, but because they had someone from the future, they were starting to think about it because they knew it was coming. So they, in the novels, they developed sort of a hospitaller service. But, you know, I had never thought about that in the follow-up with the Islamic conquest. But you got to be right about
Interesting.
that. Yeah.
Surely you read Procopius. He mentions it.
I have a problem with Prokofiev because in order to make the plot work, we had to just ignore Prokofiev's claims about Antonina because it would have screwed up the plot. So the device I took, David thought, well, let's just ignore it. And I said, we don't have to. We can, because Prokofiev wrote 3 things that survived. The wars, which are generally considered pretty good history. The plague, the secret history, which is obviously,
gossip
at best. It would be as if the only thing surviving from a period was a National Enquirer article and people took it seriously as history. And then he wrote the Buildings, I think it was called, which was
right.
the Soviet-style paean of praise for Justinian. So the same guy manages to write 3 completely different things in a lifetime. So the stance we took was he was a liar, and never mind. I actually had a lot of fun with that.
I
Now,
love Procopius stuff.
now, anybody else in regards to this question?
Well, the effects of disease on history and on human beings is of course substantial, and it has to do even with our sexual mores. There are diseases that a male will shrug off that can devastate a female human, certainly her reproductive capacity. And this may have played just as big a role in the sexual responses of our genders, both culturally and perhaps innately, just as much as the danger of being impregnated. Because this is, I mean, you find, for instance, in the periods of the certainly during the 1632 series, but also Victorian era, a lot of the aristocracy would love their wives and kids, but it would be a normal thing to go off whoring. And they would bring these nasty things home, and it would help to explain why the fecundity of so many royal houses and noble houses actually was very low. And that was somewhat of a saving grace, that it allowed some degree of culling of these inbred
Cultural houses. Interesting.
Yeah. But in any event, I'll supply the link to the Giving Plague because it talks about the opposite extreme, which is the possibility that sometimes these microorganisms become commensal. A certain fraction, I've seen estimates from 5% to as high as 15% of our genomes were incorporated into our chromosomes as residuum from diseases. And it is sort of the way in which chinchillas and humans mate with each other. No, I didn't want to make a Richard Gere reference, but I mean mate in a genetic sense, not an involuntary servitude sense.
Let's not go there.
I'll go there. In any event, so the notion that we may have commensal diseases, well, our guts are filled with them.
Mhm.
The whole microbiome is filled with commensal and helpful bacteria that probably once killed us, certainly E. coli. Variants of E. coli out there will kill you, but the ones we happen to get in our guts most of the time have found a commensal niche. And that's an interesting aspect to all of this.
Interesting. So the follow-up question to this would be actually, how do we, with these pandemics shaping history, how as writers do you convey that to your audience? Edith?
It's all a question of showing and not telling. When you're writing, you have to show what's going on. And if you simply say certain things happen at a certain time, you're not telling a story. And if you're going to have a pandemic in a story, you have to show the consequence. I believe the Stephen King novel, The Stand, certainly shows the consequence of some kind of pandemic and what happens. And it's quite riveting. And I also believe that World War Z is actually a good study on a pandemic, although it's quite fictional.
Interesting.
Yes, well, World War Z certainly, through the art of exaggeration, because of course we have that one scene in which Brad Pitt is looking over his shoulder at a very distinctive looking redhead we saw. And very well telescoped the notion of the fleeing potential victim becoming a victim and then becoming a carrier. Highly telescoped in 1/32 scene. That was actually a rare moment of competence in cinema.
Yes, it was.
Oh, nasty, David.
Yeah.
But then, of course, you look at reality, too. We had problems with diphtheria and cholera and typhoid for forever. Basically, whenever we congregated together, something like that has come up. And since the early 1900s and serious attempts at water purification, we've actually been able to get rid of most of those, along with the vaccinations for those.
Well, one of the things that began, I hadn't even thought of this when I started writing the book, but as I did the studying of 1632 series, is that what really hammered down infectious disease had nothing to do with medicine. They had reduced the rate of death from infectious disease by the end of the 19th century enormously, and it was simply a matter of public sanitation. I mean, that's what did it. They didn't really develop, penicillin didn't come around till my grandfather on my mother's side died at the age of 32 back in the 1930s, because he slipped on the ice and broke his collarbone, and the doctor told him to get bed rest, so he lay in bed for 2 weeks and developed pneumonia. And pneumonia is already as dangerous today, but I mean, in those days it was just absolutely a killer because there was there were no antibiotics. And what really did it though was sanitation, and that then became a dramatic feature of the series, because one of the things that the radicals, the committees of correspondence, they call themselves, take up, it becomes one of their clarion calls, is what they think modern sanitation techniques, and they get very rigorous about enforcing it. And so all of a sudden you get sewers. And the trick is how you put it in fiction, because the problem with disease is just distant enough that, I mean, it's present in the sense of the effects of it, but it's pretty hard to make a virus a character in a story, you know what I mean? There are no mustachio twirling bacterium. So how do you dramatize it? And you can do it, but you have to think about it. And once you do it, I can make a very, very good case. I've done it on occasion. It always gets me in trouble, and probably will again. But that democracy is based on bureaucracy. Because, and so is health, because if you don't have people whose job it is to enforce the rules, and what Virginia said is quite true, you go back just 200-300 years and
it changes
completely. I mean, you have governments that are not really what we think of as governments. And I have to say, one of the things that I have enjoyed the most is just a gimmick. I just really enjoy it, is in the 1632 series, how the Europeans of the time, especially the Germans, their reaction to Americans is, God, these people are obsessive. They're anal retentive. They are the most bureaucratic people in the world. I mean, they got rules about everything, you know?
And these are West Virginians.
And these are West Virginians, right, on top of everything else. But it's just, yeah, but they're, late 20th century West Virginians, and people by then are accustomed to, you stand in line, you fill out the forms, you do what everybody else does. But as annoying as it is, and it is annoying for everybody, without it, you don't have a democratic society. You don't. What you have is some people get privileges and get ahead of the line, and other people just do what they can do.
Which leads me to my next question. And my next question is, essentially, we've seen, like, in the past, a great many, pandemics and so on and so forth. But if we look at history, future history, science fiction, and so on, and to a certain extent, even our own current culture is genuinely been taken quite by surprise by what is happening. Future history, science fiction does not depict many pandemics in, the far-flung future. I mean, especially not when it deals with, frankly, human society. That's always a great alien civilization that's wiped out by a plague. But human societies have always been depicted as more or less kind of pandemic free. Is that true? Outside of a couple of incidences, you mentioned the Andromeda strain, that doesn't exist. And how can we actually portray that, and will that be portrayed in future science fiction, especially with our most recent events?
When I was in graduate school, I had medical student housemates. UCSD is one of the top medical schools in the world. And one of them was about to graduate and asked me my advice as a futurist, because even back then I was a much younger guy actually writing science fiction, about what field he should residency in. And I said, infectious disease. And he said, what? And I said, mark my words, we are in a fool's paradise. And of course, the next year, announcements started pouring forth about AIDS and all of that sort of thing. He's always treated me with respect since then, which a lot of people don't. Now, the point is that obviously we're living in a time when things are stressing us out. As Eric pointed out, I don't think we're going to get any disagreement from members of this panel that we could do with a healthier attitude towards being members of a civilization, a scientific civilization, a civilization not all of whose civil servants are dire deep state plotters, including very ones who won the Cold War, who saved us from Hitler, Stalin, and Bin Laden. This is a really weird incantation. And there's only one person who benefits from that incantation, and we know he lives in Moscow. Putting that aside, at the beginning of all of this, one heard some pundits saying something that one has not heard since, and that is that the COVID-19 will turn out to have been a very good exercise showing our vulnerabilities at very low death rates. Well, in fact, that's what it is. Now, there are terrible things about this ailment that I think are getting underplayed, and one is the residual effects, the lurker effects that the virus seems to lurk in some people, and residual damage that seems to affect even the young people who seem to shrug it off. Now, not all of them, but a large enough number. And the death rate is irrelevant because the doctors are getting better at ICU management. It's the hospitalization rate, but it's also the rate of residual damage to blood vessels, nervous systems. This is what really worries me over the long run about this disease. But it may very well be that those people commenting about this at the beginning, saying that this is an exercise that is exposing our difficulties, that if we're governed properly, we can then act to address these failures of resilience. There's still an argument for that.
Go ahead.
It's almost like an intelligence test. Can we figure out what to do, when to do, and how to play it? History is full of pandemics, as you said, David. And this is just another little nexus point in the whole list of things we have to learn to deal with. And with COVID, I don't think anything's going to be the same after this settles out.
I agree with that.
Wait a minute, say that again, Edith.
I do not believe anything will be the same after it settles out.
No, I agree with you.
Which actually leads to a follow-up question. And I'm sorry, I haven't gotten to everybody yet, but you just gave it how will, in the future, especially let's say if you wanted to write in a science fiction future where there was a massive pandemic, how does that shape society, and how do you convey that shape of society to your readers as well?
There's a problem because there's just a fact that we simply don't know and won't for a while. And that is this. I am absolutely convinced that there is plenty of other life in the universe that did not originate here, or that we did not originate there. So that, in other words, they evolved completely separately. Whether, I think that's absolutely certain about simple life, unicellular life. Whether complex life develops frequently, that's another issue. And I think people, because it happened here, tend to assume that the evolution of complex life is a given and the evolution of intelligence is a given. And in fact, it actually came very late in history, and there's really no clear evidence that there's a strong evolutionary impulse in that direction. But that bacteria exist all over the universe, I don't doubt for a minute. Here's the question that we don't know. Is the bacterium or the life forms that evolve completely separately from our own lineage on a different planet, can they interact with us at all? Either in terms of giving us disease, in terms of providing us with food, we simply don't know. In other words, we're assuming that the biochemistry is going to be pretty much the same everywhere. But is that true? And we just don't know. I mean, the DNA on Earth is all basically based on 4 chemicals. Guanine, adenine, I can never remember the other 2, but I know you can, Alexa.
Well, adenosine and uracil.
Right. But is that true on a planet around, another star? I don't know.
Well, and then my question.
For a while. So the point is, it could be that once we get beyond our planet, we will discover, hey, we're pretty well impervious to everything.
And my question would be this.
Or it
So,
could be that we discover all kinds of new
Well, this is
things.
that
Well,
can-
my
This is
question,
Stanley Robinson. This is what Kim Stanley Robinson makes in his extremely dyspeptic book Aurora, where he said, all right, you've been nagging me all my career to get out of the solar system. I'll do it once and show that it can't be done. Now, he's my bro, and I think he's one of the greatest geniuses in the history of our field, but that's actually quite hilarious. But he does raise some very important points.
Wait a minute, who is this, David?
Kim Stanley Robinson.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Now, the point, to summarize what I think Eric just said, is that if we find other places where we'll be able to eat, then that means that there will be things they're able to eat us.
Yeah.
and then my question was this: is that, I mean, are we looking at pandemics as essentially, this might be, pandemics, are they one of the great filters in the universe? In terms of not only life on this planet, but life on others as well.
Well, if the story I'm going to give you the link at the bottom talks about the rough negotiations. It makes sense over the long run for a pathogen to find a way of living peaceful to some degree with its host. But that negotiation is very rough in nature. Nature doesn't care if a lot of death happens along the way to that negotiation, and extinctions along the way to that negotiation. And medicine is designed to
Ameliorate.
to help that negotiation happen in a fashion that goes more in the direction of our benefit. And it could very well be that those negotiation processes are very primitive when we go to a new place. It certainly was for the Native American who lived in this hemisphere.
Yes.
Well, and you see the same thing with Justinian's plague, because the European population, when it was hit by Justinian's plague, so far as we know, that was the first time bubonic plague arrived in the West. And the death rates were you saw the same death rates you see with Native Americans. You know, and the same thing happened with the Black Death. A disease that is so virulent that it kills, huge percentage of people, actually tends to burn itself out. Because you're quite right, David. From the point of view of the virus, it's actually stupid to be too dangerous because you're basically burning up your own host. But like you said, given that the virus has no brains at all, the negotiation process takes a long time, and it's rough.
And then finally, I would say one of the things that I'd be curious as writers, what everybody would say in terms of viruses, not only that can affect, that affect societies and so on, but viruses that inadvertently can be used, weaponized viruses have been with us since, the Mongol invasions and probably before. Will we, in the future, are pandemic viruses going to be something that can be used both to, clearly affect not only societies and certain cultures, but an entire people like humanity?
Yes.
Has anybody else been reading Mira Grant's news flash series?
No, I have not.
I have not, but
She's terrific, though.
I will have to look that up.
Could you summarize, Virginia?
Please.
The Kellis-Amberley virus, which results from the combination in a laboratory of two innocuous and indeed well-intentioned experiments, gets out into the wild.
Oh my.
and is in fact a major pandemic. So that a couple of decades later, you have and this again was written several years ago, at least it started several years ago, written where your testing facilities, every place you go, you have your fingerprint, you have your retina scan before you are allowed in.
And
it makes any prophylactic techniques that have attempted to be used this time around quite mild looking.
so essentially, this is what we were saying before about society being changed by the germs that sweep through it, as opposed to society changing, you know, how germs interact with us. So it's essentially the reverse, that, you know, society has to change in order to adapt to the pandemics that affect it.
And Richard Dawkins coined. Go ahead, Virginia, please.
I think we are still far away from being able to control innovative bacteria and viruses, on a continental level.
Excellent. And Dr. Brin?
Well, maybe 30, 40 years ago, Richard Dawkins coined the word meme, and we're all familiar with it. It's entered the vernacular. And everything. Well, I mean, if there was any plague that was threatening the survival of Western civilization, it's more on the memic level than the bacterial or viral level. I mean, if you look across, this is one of the slides I give when I give these talks about threats, civilization threats, is that every new means of communication since the printing press it's been denounced by pessimists who said human beings won't be able to deal with these expansions of what we can know outside our head, what we can see, like through glass lenses, and what we can pay attention to. Humans will be driven mad by it. And always optimists said, no, people are going to be made better, wiser, wider, bigger minds. And always the pessimists were right in the short term. And the optimists were proved right in the long term. And the printing press produced voluminous amounts of horrible tracts, exacerbating the religious wars of Europe, which is pure meat for this crowd, because that's exactly when it was happening. But over time, books did spread and inoculate people with a notion of a wider world that they could deal with. We almost all died of the same phenomenon happening with radios and loudspeakers in the 1930s. The one exception I can think of, obviously it's happening now, and we can't afford the amount of time that it took to bridge across the danger zone with these new technologies of ours. The one exception I can think of is television. Much maligned. Everybody talked, all intellectuals hated it. My cousin Newton Minnow called it a vast wasteland. And yet, if you look across history, Gandhi and Martin Luther King and the victims of McCarthy, they all credited television with having saved their lives.
Marshall McLuhan.
They saved television.
I fully agree with you, David. Television gets dumped on all the time, but I know because of the era I grew up in, television also was probably what ended the Vietnam War faster than anything else would have, because all of a sudden you could see it. And it's one thing if it's something you hear about in a very far distant place, even if it's your own people involved in the fighting, but you know, it's still, they're having an experience somewhere, but you know, it's you might get a letter every once in a while, but it's not the same thing as being able to.
It was television. I think the reason why it worked so well was it was a consensus reality moderated by very well-intentioned and sincere professionals. And certainly the internet today is not.
Oh,
Yeah, but I tell you what, though, David, people are making exactly the same, you know, predictions of the internet is destroying society and all the rest of it. And it certainly does cause some rough moments. But I fully agree with you that we will wind up being inoculated, so to speak, from it, and the long-term effects will be positive. They almost always work out that way. Yeah, but it can be a little rough in the short term. One of the things that I occasionally, when I get into the argument, instead of walking away from it, about, you know, people getting upset about, you know, some of the restrictions that are being placed on people today because of COVID-19. And it's like, you want to know what quarantine's like? If you develop Ebola in a village in Africa, your neighbors will completely isolate you, and you have no choice. You stay there, and we'll make sure that you do not violate it, because it's one way that'll keep it from, you know, and yeah, most of you die. That's your, you know, too bad. Well, the same methods of quarantine applied all the way through, going back, I don't know about Justinian's era, but I know starting in the Black Death in medieval Europe, they did in the early modern period, they took quarantining very seriously. And
Absolutely.
And they could get kind of medieval about it if you broke the rules. And, you know, I think, yeah, we will, I agree COVID's going to change a lot of things. It already is. And I think some of those things are not going to come back.
Okay.
Finally, one of the things it's demonstrating is that there's a lot of things you can do virtually, so to speak, that are actually pretty efficient. And
Which is actually going to be our final question. And because we're almost out of time, so we have time for one more question, and then a quick wrap up. You know, we've seen this all happen, and you know, Zoom. I didn't know about Zoom, frankly, until the beginning of all of this. How in the future, when we write about, you know, pandemics, both current and in the past and in the future, how is technology going to shape the consensual reality of everyone in that society? Because, I mean, we've seen it, and how can we actually present that again to our readers?
as a teaching professional in the classroom, since the pandemic began, since the COVID began, I have been on virtual school. And I have Zoom conferences with my students. And if it's on a Zoom, it's on Google. If it's on a Google or Zoom, that's through something called Blackboard. And some students are really adapting extremely well to it, to the point where they don't want to come back to the classroom. It's much easier to sit at the kitchen table, have breakfast, and talk to your English teacher about what to say about the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock than it is to come in the classroom and be annoyed by everybody. And as a matter of fact, they're eating things up faster and more effectively.
Interesting.
So I don't mind the conferencing teaching at home. I don't mind actually right now going to a classroom and having a smart board in front of me with 26 faces on it, each one having its own agenda, because it's effective and efficient, and a few kids do turn up for their classroom. And we're all masked up, of course, but it's different, it's interesting, and everybody wants to work faster and smarter, and they all miss each other, so they want to be in the interactions so you see their classmates.
Interesting. Virginia, we haven't heard from you recently.
On this particular aspect of it, I really do not have a lot to contribute on writing how it would impact in the future, because it would make so much of a difference if future pandemics are fast moving like smallpox or slow moving like tuberculosis. Because the kind of isolation that has to be taken there, we would almost have to know what kind of a pandemic or brilliant minds were inventing before we could write the response to it. If I spent about 10 years working as a historian for the Office of Federal Acknowledgement, which deals with American Indian world, which I will still call Indian since that is the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and that was where I was. And one of what I dealt with was the public health, going back to what Eric said, campaign against tuberculosis in the late 19th and early 20th century. And the tendency of so many journalists today to think that the government officials who were campaigning against spittoons and public spitting were somehow, you know, these uptight Victorians who were making people not express their real natural feelings. There was a reason for it.
Excellent. Ms. Holland?
Cecilia, you've cut out again.
Ah, shit. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, ma'am.
my work is in the past. I don't do the future. I don't
Yes,
think
ma'am.
I have any real place to put this. The one thing I keep thinking about, this has all been a fascinating discussion, is that, for instance, in the Black Plague, when the Black Plague hit, people didn't know what a germ was. So they thought it was an act of God. And they thought God was punishing them. They thought for a long time it was the end of the world. When they survived, there's a kind of upsurge of optimism that is part of the fuel for the new secular revolutions of the coming centuries. And I think that might happen here, where
Interesting.
if we can get through this in some way, we will have proved that we can overcome a dangerous enemy, and we will feel more confident and feel more able to cope. But as I say, the future is not my place.
Yes, ma'am. Dr. Brin?
Well, you know, we're living in a sci-fi universe. We have been all my life, sci-fi experiment world. And
I still want my moon colony.
yeah, well, you know, turned out that space was hard, and we did. I have an essay about 2001 that I published in 2001.
I read it.
Space
Very
Odyssey, and one of the things I point out is we have a tendency to be obsessed in particular ways, and like nobody seems to comment on how the world of 2001: A Space Odyssey was much farther along in space, but nowhere near as far along in creating a just society.
Yeah.
It's secretive, dominated by prissy, superioristic, smug white ortho males. If we sent a mission to Jupiter on a Discovery type ship today, there'd be at least one woman aboard who would actually talk to poor Hal instead of driving him into a paranoid frenzy. So, you know,
Wow.
I think that it's important to do what vast numbers on the right and a fair number on the far left don't want us to do, and that is say, well, yes, but. And that's how we maintain resilience. That's how we maintain some degree of flexibility and a wide stance. And that's how I get to be very unpopular among the people I just described. So I'll provide a link to an essay describing not just disease, but other areas in which our civilization has allowed its resilience to get way too low.
Yes, sir.
And meanwhile, you guys are the explorers, the Ring of Fire community of brilliant authors, and I'm looking forward to reading a couple more because Eric just sent me a package.
Did it arrive yet?
Well, I got it.
Oh, it arrived. Good, good.
Excellent.
I sent you the squid book in there too. I think
Yeah, no, it's beautiful.
I think you'll enjoy it. Yeah.
And Virginia, I'm looking forward especially to your next item.
Thank you.
It's
And
coming out very soon, and if it's the Adventures of a Lutheran Pastor. Virginia, you're the only person I know who could write and make that interesting. I mean, well, no, seriously, the Adventures of a Lutheran Pastor. Okay.
okay, we have less than 5 minutes, so Mr. Flint, and then we can go
The only
one last
two
person.
things I want to say is very broad. One of them is one. I am sure of two things. One, I'm absolutely sure of, is that we're going to be surprised because time after time after time, we think we know what something is, and it turns out we had no idea that it was going to look like that at all. One of the obvious ways to say that is to look at all the planets that we've discovered in other solar systems, and none of them were anything like we thought we knew how planets got formed. And the other is that I generally write quite optimistic and for lack of a better term, rather sunny books, and I get challenged about it fairly often. And my point is that you can lose the forest for the trees. There's all kinds of horrible stuff that's happened in human history. I'm not at all Pollyannish about that, and I put a fair amount of it in my books, although I try not to dwell on it. But you need to have the right yardstick to measure things. And the yardstick is not 1 or 2 human lifetimes or even a few centuries. The yardstick I think you have to start with is that not much more than 5,000 years ago, a few places on the earth had begun to develop civilization. Enormous amounts of time and effort were spent building tombs and other monuments for a very small number of people. And today we can see almost to the edge of the universe and almost back to the beginning of time. The world is inhabited by over 7 million people, at least half of whom, probably quite a bit more than that, but certainly half of whom have lives that they pretty well control, at least have a great deal of control over themselves and can do what they wanted to a certain degree, much more than was ever true today. So stop whining is kind of you know, it's just, yes, there's all kinds of crap happens, absolutely, but we've gone that far in 5,000 years. Keep that as your yardstick before you get too gloomy.
I think that actually is it's my #1 explanation for the Fermi paradox. And as you know, I've been cataloging these since 1982. And among the 100 or so potential explanations for the Fermi paradox, the apparent absence of extraterrestrial civilizations, #1, in my opinion, is that we are anomalously smart. Now, others, I believe, may approach our level of intelligence the hard way, incrementally. And since we were already destroying the planet when we invented herding goats and primitive irrigation agriculture, we were already spreading deserts. The amazing thing is that we went from there to seeing what we're doing and thinking about it analytically in just 6,000 years, while the planet still is somewhat salvageable.
Burdened.
If it took us 150,000 years to get there, there'd have been almost nothing left. And that may be a very wide explanation for the Fermi paradox.
Someday I
hadn't considered that.
Someday my own explanation is somewhat close to yours, and that is that Ernst Mayr, the great biologist, got in a debate with Carl Sagan, which I think Sagan didn't really understand what he was saying. And I think a lot of people who follow SETI don't, because they tend to be oriented toward the hard sciences, which is that evolution, the complexity involved and the just sheer blind luck to evolve an intelligent species like ours is so enormous that it's not surprising at all, even with trillions of galaxies, that it doesn't happen that often. And given the enormity of space, when it does happen, the civilizations are going to be very, very far apart from each other in all likelihood.
I would something else, Eric. I think a major contributor to the resilience of human society is that most human beings are not terribly emotionally sensitive. If you look in the past, 40% of the people in the village die. What happens the next year? The widows and widowers marry one another, they have more kids, and they keep going. Basically, human beings, most of them, when you come right down to it, are not emo.
Warrior genes.
Yeah, it's, I think perhaps a somewhat nicer way to put that is we handle grief well. But yeah, you're right about that.
Okay. Well, we are just about, first of all, I want to thank my entire panel for being amazing and actually having this conversation, which is both, I could personally stay here for another 10, 20 hours and just pepper you guys with questions on anything. But unfortunately, we are at time. I want to thank my amazing panel for bringing out some, amazing questions and conclusions actually that I hadn't thought of. Thank you. I'm going to give everybody a chance to just go around one last time. And if you have a book or something that you want to link to, please make sure that you tell us. Starting with Virginia, please.
Well, I don't know. The last book out is, as he says, things could be worse. And those are the Pastor Kastenmeier adventures. And coming after that is Designed to Fail, which is not out yet, but will be on the province of Westphalia within the USE, and has, I think, one of my more interesting protagonists, who
Excellent.
is not a hero, but neither is he a villain. He just doesn't happen to agree.
Awesome. Edith?
Love and Chemistry by Jack Carroll and Edith Wilde is a fun read. My students have told me so when they found it. And yes, I am also still writing. I'm working on a couple different things right now. And it's really a fun ride to be able to write, think, and go back over, make sure you're on the right path with your book and you don't fall off of it. And it really does work.
Excellent. Dr. Brin?
Yeah, well, I've self-published a couple of things. Now we have a new deal that I'll be talking about in another panel with Eric and with Ring of Fire Press for a great old series that we're reviving. But anybody who's interested, during the next 6 weeks or so, I have a political book that I self-published called Polemical Judo that nobody in the upper political castes is paying the slightest attention to, and has more than 100 suggested tactics to get out of trench warfare. And I have a comedy called The Ancient Ones, which got its first legs in Eric's old magazine for Bane's Universe magazine, the first couple of, and people have been nagging me for years, and it's a sci-fi comedy. So
That is excellent.
I'll be doing a reading from both Colony High and from The Ancient Ones in this other panel. Unless, when these are all set up to show, that panel comes before this one.
No,
In which case I'll plug the disease one.
I'm pretty sure, David, that we're having this one on Saturday and the one on the Colony High series tomorrow.
All right, so
That is
Tomorrow
correct.
in the future.
It's plugged. And may I say one last thing? I am proud to being a Ring of Fire author. I just did one little thing. I just did one. Meddled with the DNA a little tiny bit, but I'm proud.
I
Excellent.
was delighted to have you write that story.
Miss Holland?
Well, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Okay, I've been listening with great attention to all this, and what Eric said has resonated with me. It reminds me of what Milton said. We are born not innocent, but ignorant rather, and that none of us knows very much. Nobody knows enough. There's going to be one surprise after another. We have to stay open. We have to stay light on our feet. But that's very optimistic, it seems to me.
That's
Yes, it is.
excellent. And Mr. Flint?
The next book I have coming out is coming out in November. It's called 1637, No Peace Beyond the Line. It's part of the 1632 series. And for those people who enjoyed the Eddie Cantrell line that goes all the way back to the very first book, it's a continuation of that. Then after that, in January, I believe, the next book in this, a different alternate history I started that uses the same premise as 1632, but in this case, a modern cruise ship is transplanted back into the ancient Mediterranean right after the death of Alexander the Great. And the first book in that was called The Alexander Inheritance, and the sequel, The Macedonian Hazard, is coming out in January. And then in May, another 1632 novel is coming out called 1637, The Peacock Throne, which takes place in India, Mughal India, and it's a sequel to Mission of the Mughals. And we're doing another anthology for Stories of Granville Gazette. And the book I am actually now writing, although I've kind of been working on this lately, but is a book I'm doing with David Weber. Just as he has worked in my universe, I have worked in his Honor Harrington universe, and this is the fourth book we will do together in that universe. And the title right now is Cloak of Alignment. It may not stay that, but that's where it is now.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And, keep on hanging by for more information and more panels from Ring of Fire Press.